Good evening. My name is Michelle Fernandez, and I am from the Department of Programs and Partnerships here at Arlington Public Library. Thank you all so much for joining us here today to hear Steven Levingston discuss his book, Kennedy and King, The President, the Pastor, and the Battle Over Civil Rights. Special thanks to our partners at One More Page Books for being here with us and making copies of Kennedy and King available for purchase. Mr. Levingston's appearance is part of the Arlington Public Library's system-wide celebration of Black History Month. For a listing of other Black History Month programs, visit us online at library.arlingtonva.us/blackhistory. Follow us on social media, and we have some book displays on the second floor and throughout some of our branches, and pick up one of the flyers on your way out if you don't have one already. Tonight's speaker, Steven Levingston, is the nonfiction editor at the Washington Post. He has also worked for the Wall Street Journal, the International Herald Tribune, the Associated Press, and the China Daily, and has worked in Beijing, Hong Kong, and Paris. He grew up in Southern California and holds degrees from UC Berkeley and Stanford University. In addition to Kennedy and King, Mr. Levingston has written two other books, Little Demon in the City of Light, a true story of murder and mesmerism in Belle Epoque Paris, published in 2014, and The Kennedy Baby, The Loss That Transformed JFK, published in 2013. Kennedy and King has received widespread praise. Congressman and civil rights leader John Lewis described it as the story of two brilliant leaders who injected new meaning into the veins of American society. Together, their influence created a moral imperative that changed the US and the world. Levingston's book is both historical and visionary. By reminding us of these great leaders and their accomplishments, this book will fuel your passion for the new work we still need to accomplish in our society. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Steven Levingston.
Nice. Thank you very much. And it's great to be here. Thank you for having me, and thank you all for coming. I should say first that I have this audio-visual presentation that you can see here, and sometimes these things go a little haywire, and if anything goes wrong as we're putting it together here, we can all just laugh along together. How about that? I should also say that some of the images, particularly the video that I'll be showing, is old and grainy. So be prepared for that, and even though they are not the greatest things to look at, in some respects because of the graininess, they are delicious, as you'll see. But anyway, I'm really glad to have the chance to discuss my book here, so close to where much of the action of the book actually took place. For most of our history, our presidents have laid their heads at the White House, not far from here, and those men have been of all types, some wonderful and admirable, others less so. The contrast among these men over the years tells us a lot about the nation we have been and the one we might become. 50 years ago, we had a president who was civil, charming, and witty. He was handsome as a movie star, and yet he had no trouble joking about himself. He was self-effacing. He didn't feel a need to take credit for things that he couldn't rightly claim. Far from it. In 1961, he traveled to Paris for an important summit meeting, and there his wife took center stage. The French fell in love with her. She dressed beautifully, she spoke French. The president realized she had stolen the heart of just about every French man and woman. In fact, she had upstaged him. But did he complain? Did he whimper? Did he try to steal the limelight back? No. He took it with his usual ease and elegance. A lot of us will remember his good humor about it as he was speaking to the press. See if we can get this to come up.
I do not think it altogether inappropriate to introduce myself to this audience. I am the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris, and I've enjoyed it.
Yes, 50 years ago we had a president who understood irony, and often, as his aide Arthur Schlesinger put it, it was directed at himself. It helped him to lighten crises and hold people and problems in balance. It was an unending source of perspective and an essential part of the way he criticized himself. President Kennedy was skeptical of those who believed they went only from success to success, and he was keenly aware of his own failings and acknowledged his stumbles. When his predecessor, Dwight Eisenhower, published the first volume of his presidential memoir, Kennedy dryly commented, "Apparently Ike never did anything wrong." Then he told an aide, "When we come to write our memoirs of this administration, we'll do it differently." We've come a long way from those days. 50 years ago, we had a president who placed a high importance on speaking the truth as best he could to the American people. He respected the role of the free press. As he put it, the news media are invaluable as a check on what is going on in the administration. And he added, there isn't any doubt that we could not do the job at all in a free society without a very, very active press. We are in a different era today. I can't imagine President Kennedy asserting that the press is the enemy of the American people. Sure, he didn't like having his mistakes and failures revealed, but he never shut out reporters. Quite the contrary, he appeared regularly before the news media. He held a televised press conference every 16 days on average, 64 of them during his short term. The press gave him a hard time now and then, and in private he talked about his frustrations with the media, but he never insulted a reporter in public. When he got questions he didn't like, he kept his cool. He relied on his wit.
Mr. President, the Democratic platform in which you ran for election promises to work for equal rights for women, including equal pay, to wipe out job opportunity discriminations. Now, you have made efforts on behalf of others. What have you done for the women according to the promises of the platform?
Well, I'm sure we haven't done enough, and I must say I am a strong believer in equal pay for equal work, and I think that we ought to do better than we're doing, and I'm glad that you reminded me of it.
50 years ago, we were in a dangerous Cold War with the Soviet Union, and the world sometimes felt poised at the edge of nuclear Armageddon. But President Kennedy never taunted the Soviet Union, never called Premier Khrushchev by any derogatory names. Despite the tensions, Kennedy maintained a sense of fun and was ready with a laugh. As part of our Cold War competition, we were in a space race with our communist adversaries. It was one crucial battlefield in our undeclared war, and the Soviets were ahead of us. They had already shot a man into orbit around the Earth, and we were still at the stage of sending chimps on test flights. This is Enos, the space chimp. In November 1961, Enos was sent into orbit at the very same time President Kennedy was holding one of his press conferences. Just as the president was about to take another question, he was handed news of the launch.
I guess this chimpanzee who was flying in space took off at 10:08. He reports that everything is perfect and working well.
Well, yes, today things are different. Humor, charm, and civility have been erased from the political landscape. That's disappointing. But there's something even more to consider. I mention this difference between America today and 50 years ago only because it raises a curious historical question, a question that seems all the more pertinent now, and it's this. Does John Kennedy have any relevance to our world today? And we could go further and ask, does history have any relevance to America today? John Kennedy had an answer for this. He once said, "We celebrate the past to awaken the future." Now, the trick with writing history and reading it is you want it to have meaning, to reveal something about our lives as we live them now. And the beautiful thing is, history is alive. It's the story of all of our lives, public and private. It's the story of our perpetual struggle to improve ourselves and our nation. It's the story of our quest to be better than we have been. And that's why I believe the tale in my book, Kennedy and King, is as relevant now as it was in its own time in the early 1960s. Then, as now, our president guided the nation by the way he comported himself. Then, as now, we struggled with issues of conscience, empathy, and acceptance of our fellow Americans. Then, as now, we spoke truth to power and demanded that power listen and learn. And then, as now, we knew that our progress toward a more perfect union required our president to grow in office, to demonstrate moral courage and fidelity to our founding principles. So history is not musty at all. It doesn't sit on a shelf in some dark place. It is always fresh and challenging, messy and complicated. If you gaze at it through a certain prism, you will see it is the story of today. So now let's travel back in time to 1963. It's time to laugh. Oh. What happened? Well, that's how 1963 looked and sounded. And I'm going to try to make it another sound here.
I met a white man who walked a black dog. I met another man who was wounded in hatred. And it's a hard race are gonna fall.
And it also sounded and looked like this as well. But then there was also this.
We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities. Whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place?
And that was John Kennedy in 1963 in June, talking from the Oval Office, speaking to the nation. And in those short few minutes, he became America's first civil rights president. And that's the common image of John Kennedy, champion of civil rights. For many years, there were three portraits side by side on the wall of many African-American homes. There was Jesus, Martin Luther King, and John F. Kennedy. But how Kennedy landed on that wall is a very complicated story. The John Kennedy who spoke to the nation in June of 1963 was not the same man who entered the White House in January 1961. That earlier Kennedy, the young, charismatic new president, was not a civil rights advocate. He was more concerned about his political agenda than the struggles of 20 million black Americans. It took him 2.5 years to evolve into a president who saw civil rights as a moral necessity. And that's the storyline of my book. It begins really with a simple question. How did the John Kennedy of 1961 become the John Kennedy of 1963? The answer contains many parts. It is made up of Kennedy's character, his personal development, and his desire to shine in history. But there was also this. President Kennedy had a guiding spirit. You could say an angel on his shoulder. The deeper you look at those 2.5 years, the more carefully you look, everywhere you look, stands the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. His preaching, his reasoning, his leadership, and most important, his moral authority. Martin Luther King was instrumental in guiding President Kennedy toward his awakening on civil rights. But like all of us, Kennedy was also driven from within. He was in a permanent state of becoming. He was always seeking to be better than he was. The people closest to him recognized He had an enormous capacity for growth. Ted Sorensen signed on as an aide to Senator Kennedy in 1953 and stayed with him for the next 10 years. He was struck by Kennedy's curiosity, by the way he absorbed new information, the way he studied new circumstances, the way he accepted new attitudes. Kennedy carefully sifted his experiences for their significance, and when necessary, he changed his mind. He was a patient listener and a voracious reader. There it goes. As Sorensen put it, no attribute he possessed in 1953 was more pronounced or more important than his capacity for growth, his willingness to learn, his determination to explore and to inquire and to profit by experience. But there was something more to Kennedy's determination to improve himself. There was in him a raw ambition for greatness. John Kennedy favored the great man theory of history, the notion that larger-than-life personalities guided the course of human destiny. Of course, large, impersonal forces were always at work influencing the direction of history, but ultimately, according to the great man theory, it was the wisdom and boldness and decisions of certain individuals who determined the course of human life. The idea originally belonged to the 19th century thinker Thomas Carlyle. In the 1830s, Carlyle put it this way: the history of what man has accomplished in this world is at bottom the history of the great men who have worked here. Over the years, the theory was accepted by some historians and rejected by others, but it was never an all or nothing idea. Carlyle himself even acknowledged that great leaders understood that they channeled the great impersonal forces motivating their societies. As the contemporary historian Margaret Macmillan has said, leaders have choices and the capacity to take history down one path rather than another. Kennedy ascribed to the notion that history was not simply a passive unfolding of events beyond the control of individual actors. The British historian Isaiah Berlin once noted after a dinner with Kennedy that Jack's eyes, as he put it, shone with a particular glitter when he discussed men who shaped history. Kennedy wished to join the ranks of these trailblazers. He longed to mold history, to mold himself into a figure who asserted his political and moral courage and left his mark on history. And that was the key, a display of courage. John Kennedy was always measuring himself against a standard of courageousness. His father, Joseph Kennedy, encouraged his sons to adhere to a culture of manliness. Courage was essential to self-perception of the Kennedy men. Kennedys were men of action, risk, and domination. Jack's brother Joe, driven by this creed, took on a risky and dangerous World War II bombing mission that killed him. Lieutenant Jack Kennedy showed his courage in World War II after his PT boat was rammed and cut in half by a Japanese destroyer. At great risk to himself, he saved the life of one of his crewmen and earned national praise as a war hero. But with his typical charm and wit, he played down his bravery when a high school student asked him how he became a hero. Kennedy quipped, "It was easy. They sank my boat." Courage, physical, political, and moral, was never something Kennedy took lightly. From his youth to his death, he demonstrated the quiet courage required by a life of chronic illness and constant pain. Arthur Schlesinger remembered that Robert Kennedy once told him that courage was the virtue Jack most admired. As Schlesinger observed, in the first instance, this meant physical courage, the courage of men under enemy fire, of men silently suffering pain, the courage of men who stared down mobs or soared into outer space. And when he entered politics, it came to mean moral courage. But for a long time, moral courage eluded Jack Kennedy. One of the most telling instances came in 1954, when Joseph McCarthy was shaking the nation with his anti-communist demagoguery. McCarthy was running roughshod over the civil liberties of decent Americans, and the Senate had finally chosen to reprimand him. At the time, Senator John Kennedy was in a New York hospital recovering from back surgery. It was a risky operation because Jack suffered from Addison's disease, an adrenal gland disorder that heightened the chance of infection. And in fact, 3 days after the procedure, he got an infection and fell into a coma. By the time the Senate vote came, however, he was still in the hospital recovering, but he was alert and under pressure to join his colleagues to reprimand Joe McCarthy. But Kennedy hesitated. He was under personal pressures too. McCarthy was a friend, a fellow Irishman and womanizer whose company JFK had enjoyed long before his anti-communist crusade. Jack's father liked McCarthy too. He had invited him to the family estates in Hyannisport and Palm Beach. And McCarthy had even dated two of Jack's sisters, Patricia and Eunice. But McCarthy was also a menace to the nation. He had destroyed reputable men and women by falsely accusing them of having communist associations. When it came time to vote, Jack could have indicated his preference from his hospital bed, but he lost his nerve and remained silent. The Senate condemnation of McCarthy passed by a large margin, and Kennedy was the only Democratic senator who did not vote in favor of it. His moral courage had eluded him. Before his surgery, Jack had planned to write a magazine article on political and moral courage. Now the project assumed fresh importance for him. He'd been taken to task for his cowardice on the McCarthy vote, and he had come to recognize his blunder, his moral failure. And so he threw himself into this project. He overlooked the pain of his slow recovery and worked with intensity. Soon the magazine article had expanded into a book. He got considerable help from Ted Sorensen and others. Together they identified 8 senators who had risked their political careers to stand up for their principles. In the book, Kennedy told the tales of these independent men who defied their constituencies and acted on their conscience for the good of the nation. This book, of course, was Profiles in Courage. Some historians have discounted the timing of the book. Sorensen himself has written that Kennedy did not pursue the project to atone for his role in the McCarthy vote. But the fact is, Kennedy did pursue it. He could easily have dropped it, given his weakened state and his need to convalesce. Or he could have chosen another subject. But he was passionate about this issue. It preyed on his mind. Historian Doris Kearns Goodwin has observed, in choosing to write about the moral courage of others, Jack Kennedy may well have been trying to sort out his thoughts about his own courage. At this point in his life, however, Jack's moral courage was indeed only literary. By writing the book, he discovered what it took to attain moral courage, but he had not risen to the ranks of such men. Toward the end of the book, Kennedy writes in a way that sounds as though he's urging himself to greater heights. As he put it, the stories of past courage can teach. They can offer hope. They can provide inspiration. But they cannot supply courage itself. For this, each man must look into his own soul. It would take time, but eventually Kennedy did look into his own soul on civil rights. Here was his chance to demonstrate his moral courage. And again, it must be said, Kennedy's journey was not a solitary one. It was Martin Luther King who helped direct his eyes inward. Now, I'd like to tell you a tale from the book that shows the complicated relationship between these two men, Kennedy and King. The story begins just 3 weeks before the presidential election of 1960. At this moment, the destinies of John Kennedy and Martin Luther King became forever entwined. It was October 19th, and King was arrested for taking part in a sit-in at a whites-only restaurant in Atlanta. The next day, he was marched to his hearing in handcuffs and leg irons, and there a racist judge named Oscar Mitchell sentenced him to 4 months of hard labor in the state penitentiary. Mitchell claimed King's arrest at the sit-in violated the terms of his probation on an earlier traffic citation. Martin Luther King's wife, Coretta, was 6 months pregnant at the time with their third child. She was in the courtroom and she burst into tears, realizing that now she faced the prospect of giving birth 3 months later while her husband was still in prison. And the worries went deeper. King, if he were put to hard labor as the judge ordered, he'd work side by side in a road gang with white, ruthless killers, men who had nothing to lose and everything to gain by murdering an African-American celebrity and civil rights troublemaker. Now, King's imprisonment, coming as it did, just weeks before the election, put both the Kennedy and the King camps, Kennedy and Nixon camps, in a tight spot. How were they to respond? There were risks in taking action and in remaining silent. Siding with King could alienate Southern voters, but keeping quiet meant missing out on a chance to galvanize black voters north and south. In the Nixon camp, political strategists decided the safest route was silence. When asked about King's predicament, Richard Nixon issued a terse no comment through his press secretary. The Kennedy camp took a different tack. Inside the campaign, King had two passionate proponents, White House aide Harris Wofford, who was a longtime friend of the Kings, and Sergeant Shriver, John Kennedy's brother-in-law and head of the campaign's civil rights section. Soon, these two men came up with a simple but risky plan. John Kennedy needed to show some compassion. All he had to do was pick up the phone and call Coretta King. But the political fallout alarmed one of Kennedy's King advisors, Kenny O'Donnell, and he and Shriver went head-to-head. O'Donnell saw nothing but disaster for the campaign. He warned Kennedy there are a million ways politically it could be a mess. But Shriver was insistent, and he demanded a few moments with his brother-in-law in private. "You know I'm right," Shriver told O'Donnell. "Maybe," O'Donnell said. Then he reminded Shriver how things often go in politics. If it works, you'll get no credit. If it doesn't work, you'll get all the blame. At the time, Kennedy was in a hotel suite in Chicago, preparing to leave for his next campaign stop. Shriver went into the bedroom and found his brother-in-law alone, folding his clothes into his suitcase. He laid out his idea, but Kennedy didn't seem to be listening. His mind was elsewhere. Unknown to any of his campaign staff, John Kennedy himself had been outraged by King's imprisonment. Jailing King for 4 months was in Kennedy's eyes a judicial abomination. But he also knew how delicate the matter was politically, and he saw only one option: to work quietly through back channels. That morning, he had phoned the governor of Georgia to see if there was any way the governor could intercede on King's behalf. Shriver knew none of this, and he continued to argue his point. He told Kennedy that calling Coretta would show he had sympathy for a pregnant woman who was afraid for herself and for her husband. "You just need to tell Mrs. King you believe what happened to her husband was wrong," Shriver said, "and you'll do whatever you can to make it right." Kennedy zipped up his suitcase, turned to his brother-in-law. "That's a pretty good idea," he said. "How do I get to her?" And then, in the King home in Atlanta, the phone rang. After several seconds, Coretta heard a voice that was familiar to her from the recent televised presidential debates. "Good morning, Mrs. King," the voice said. "This is Senator Kennedy." There was a brief exchange of pleasantries, and then Kennedy offered his sympathy. He said he understood she was expecting a baby, and he knew how hard this must be for her. "I just wanted you to know," he told her, "that I was thinking about you and Dr. King. If there is anything I can do to help, please feel free to call on me." And that was it. The call was over. It lasted no more than 90 seconds. Afterward, Shriver informed Kenny O'Donnell, and O'Donnell was gloomy. "You just lost us the election," he said. In Washington, Bobby Kennedy flew into a rage. He was the Kennedy campaign manager, and now he saw defeat. John Kennedy showing sympathy to a civil rights leader? Why not just hand the election to Nixon? Shriver never forgot Bobby's phone call. He landed on me like a ton of bricks. He scorched my ass, Shriver remembered. Bobby was furious, saying his brother was going to lose the election because of that stupid call. But, like his brother, Bobby was privately outraged by King's treatment, and like his brother, he sought to work in back channels without anyone knowing, not even his own aides. Later that day, he made his own telephone call directly to Judge Oscar Mitchell, and he let Mitchell know in no uncertain terms that he stood in violation of the law. The fact was, the law required a man in King's situation to be freed on bail. Well, pressure quickly mounted on Mitchell, and the next day he released King on a $2,000 bond. After about 30 hours in the state penitentiary, Martin Luther King walked free and into the arms of his wife and family. He spoke to reporters and thanked John Kennedy for his concern. He also took the opportunity to let everyone know he'd heard nothing from Richard Nixon. King's good friend, the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, condemned Nixon for his silence, saying he intended to return the silence when he got into the voter booth. Black newspapers across the country rallied their readers and endorsed Jack Kennedy, the New York Amsterdam News, the Baltimore Afro-American, the Chicago Defender. Kennedy had not been known as a great friend of black voters. He was too cozy with some racist politicians, and he hadn't spoken out forcefully enough on civil rights. But in a single day, he erased his negative reputation. And the news about the call stayed mostly within the black communities. The mainstream press picked up the story, but it wasn't played very large, and the television networks gave it only modest coverage. As a result, Kennedy remarkably suffered only minor fallout among Southern whites. Now, John Kennedy never explained his reason for placing the cult to Coretta. Was he driven by politics or by goodwill? Cynics see only a man of callous manipulation, and torchbearers for Kennedy see only his grace and humanity. Martin Luther King recognized the possibility of both impulses, and they didn't necessarily contradict each other. There are those moments in history, King said, that what is morally right is politically expedient. Whatever the impulse, with the election only days away, John Kennedy was riding a wave of popularity in black homes, on the streets, and in the churches. Martin Luther King's father, a prominent Atlanta minister, was a Nixon man. He planned to vote against Kennedy because of his religion. But now, he told his congregation, Kennedy can be my president, Catholic or whatever he is. Daddy King promised to round up all the votes he could for Kennedy. I've got a suitcase, he said, and I'm going to take them up there and dump them in his lap. But Shriver and Wofford weren't taking anything for granted. They scrambled to capitalize on the black community's turn to Kennedy. They raced to produce a small pamphlet printed on cheap blue paper with the title, The Case of Martin Luther King. The aim was to highlight Kennedy's compassion in contrast to Nixon's callousness. At first, the men printed 50,000 copies, then another 250,000. In the end, some 2 million pamphlets were handed out to congregates at black churches in St. Louis, Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, Atlanta, and elsewhere. And on election day, as we know, Kennedy eked out a victory, beating Nixon by only 120,000 votes. In Illinois, Kennedy won by 9,000 votes, and 250,000 blacks turned out for him. In Michigan, he carried the state by 67,000 votes, and another 250,000 blacks cast ballots for him. Black leaders claim they gave Kennedy his margin of victory in 11 states for a total of 169 electoral votes. A Gallup poll found that overall, some 70% of African Americans voted for Kennedy. From the black perspective, it was inarguable. Their community had put John Kennedy into the White House. Now that 90-second conversation with Coretta laid massive expectations on the Kennedy presidency. Before he even settled into the White House, Jack Kennedy was put on notice that blacks from Harlem to Montgomery expected him to listen to their leader, Martin Luther King, and hear their cries for equality. But for 2.5 years, Kennedy stopped short of a full commitment to civil rights. If he went too far, he feared that powerful Southern senators would block his agenda on taxes, on unemployment, Social Security, wages, and housing.
President Kennedy has done some significant things in civil rights, but at the same time, I must say that President Kennedy hadn't done enough, and we must remind him that we elected him.
At times, Kennedy kept King at a distance, ignored him, even questioned his loyalty to America. But Martin Luther King never gave up. In speeches, television interviews, phone calls to the White House, telegrams, and occasional face-to-face meetings with the president, King was unrelenting. He challenged Kennedy, instructed him, urged him to think in moral terms about the legacy of slavery and the meaning of inequality in America. King challenged Kennedy to be a great man of history. As he declared, human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless effort of men willing to be co-workers with God. In King's eyes, improvement in the human story resulted from the conscious actions of enlightened men and women. But it took Kennedy 2.5 years to understand. 2.5 years of bus burnings, beatings, child protests, two and a half years of segregated universities, riots, and arrests. But finally, Kennedy found his moral courage. He had discovered, to the best of his ability, what it felt like to be black in America. Through his long struggle, full of many hesitations, he finally saw black lives not just through the eyes of a white, privileged New Englander, but from the perspective of a black man, a black woman, and a black child. And on that June evening in 1963, President Kennedy went before the nation. It was time, he insisted, for America's approach to civil rights to be guided by a moral commitment. It was time for the government to enact legislation.
We face, therefore, a moral crisis as a country and a people. It cannot be met by repressive police action. It cannot be left to increase demonstrations in the streets. It cannot be quieted by token moves or talk. It is a time to act in the Congress, in your state and local legislative body, and above all, in all of our daily lives.
The influence of Martin Luther King was there in the themes and language of the president's speech. And not just in Kennedy's call for a moral vision on civil rights, but in the way the president laid out his argument, the emphasis on empathy and conscience. During the Birmingham protests, King had spent time in prison, and it was from there that he wrote his famous letter from Birmingham jail. In it, he asked people to see the African-American plight through the eyes of those who have suffered, to imagine that they had a relative who had been lynched, or that they themselves had been beaten by police, or humiliated every day by signs indicating white and colored water faucets, restrooms, and dining rooms. Kennedy had absorbed King's perspective. Earlier in his speech, he described the realities of life much as King had. As we heard earlier, he said, if you were a white American subjected to such treatment, would you be content to have the color of your skin changed and stand in a black man's place? In a certain sense, King was the author of the president's civil rights speech. King's teachings had penetrated the president's conscience and were echoed in his words that night on television. As one observer noted, throughout the speech, Kennedy seemed to be channeling Martin Luther King. By 1963, John Kennedy had finally found his conscience on civil rights, and his voice. After he spoke to the nation, King sent him a telegram. He called the speech one of the most eloquent, profound, and unequivocal pleas for justice and freedom for all men ever made by any president. But just 5 months later, Kennedy was dead. Learning of the assassination, King was still in shock when he spoke to reporters, and he praised Kennedy's commitment to black justice.
He had a great understanding of the depths and dimensions of the problem, and I really feel that he was a friend to the cause of civil rights.
Back in 1954 and 55, when John Kennedy wrote Profiles in Courage, he had an idealized view of the courageous politician. And throughout most of his political career, his place among such men was largely imaginary. On civil rights, he had moved only with tentative steps, and for every advance, there was a measurable retreat. But over the months and years of his presidency, he grew almost imperceptibly as a politician, a president, and a man. On civil rights, he listened to Martin Luther King, to his brother Robert Kennedy, and to his own conscience. He observed the rising black unrest and the barbarity of the white response. The nation also was listening and evolving. In the wake of Birmingham, more than half of Americans believed that civil rights was the nation's most urgent issue. And that was up from less than 5% before the demonstrations. The president had the opportunity to address an injustice that for too long contradicted America's values. By acting on civil rights, Kennedy not only asserted his political will, he also lifted the nation onto a higher moral plane. At last, he had risen to the ideal he had envisioned for himself when he wrote Profiles in Courage. As Kennedy asserted in that book, a man does what he must in spite of personal consequences, in spite of obstacles and dangers and pressure, and that is the basis of all human morality. Looking back, Martin Luther King perhaps said it best. We saw two Kennedys, he explained. A Kennedy the first 2 years of his term, and another Kennedy emerging in 1963. In King's view, the second Kennedy was a man who not only saw the moral issues, but was also, in King's words, willing to stand up in a courageous manner for them. King's message had finally sunk in. But King also knew that historic change never came easily. What he learned from his experience with John Kennedy remains relevant to this day. As he put it, it's a difficult thing to teach a president. Thank you. So, happy to take any questions or any comments or anything.
With respect to historic support for the Republican Party by the African American community, is it fair to say that if Kennedy hadn't done so well with the black community in 1960, that Nixon would have taken most of the Republican vote, and that his call to Coretta Scott King gave him the margin of victory?
I think, yes, on the last point, and also on the earlier points, that's a very good point, because the Republican Party was becoming more enlightened on black issues, and Richard Nixon was very popular with blacks, or some blacks. Jackie Robinson in particular was a big fan of Richard Nixon. And so both parties were really starting to see that some necessary change, I think, was imperative in the country. And I think you're probably pretty much right on mark there, that if things hadn't gone, as we like to talk about history, it's never inevitable. And all of these little moments cause history to swing one way or another. We're in the middle of that right now. In the 1960 election, with King getting arrested and Kennedy deciding to make that call, that was just a moment that really caused things to move, historical trends to move in ways that you can't even really assess in some ways, just because of that one moment. It was not inevitable. So I think if that hadn't happened, we might have seen an entirely different result in the election as well. It's a very interesting point.
When Brother Bobby was Attorney General, he wiretapped Martin Luther King. Why did he do that, and what did Brother John think about it?
That's right, he did. And I think it's still a pretty bad mark on his term. Part of the problem there, I believe, came from J. Edgar Hoover, who was adamantly racist and anti-King and feared King's power and persuasion in the country, and was making up a lot of things about King. The Kennedys had no choice in some ways to believe what they were told by their FBI chief, who said he had documents, said he had proof of what he told John and Bobby Kennedy about the communist affiliations of Martin Luther King, though he wouldn't show the documents. And I guess out of a sense of security for the nation, they had to listen to their FBI chief and do what was necessary at the time.
Thank you.
I hope this isn't too off the wall, but I was in high school during this time. I had family all over the country. My grandfather lived down in Texas. My father, from Missouri, was a little bit interested in democratic politics. And what I was thinking as time went on was the third person in this kind of structure who, over the years, had a profound effect. That's Lyndon Johnson. I sense that people thought at the time of the nomination that he was put on the ticket to balance Kennedy, so that he wouldn't be like too much of a New England liberal, but he certainly had a very unusual role for a Texas politician. So, do you have any thoughts about Lyndon Johnson's, how he got into this and how his, how he got into it and how it worked with him?
Well, as we all know, Lyndon Johnson was instrumental in passing the legislation after Kennedy's death, and in many respects, it might have been a lot harder if John Kennedy was still the president trying to pass that legislation, because Lyndon Johnson was a man of the Senate, understood how to work the Senate, and as president, he was able to do that in a very effective way. So, I mean, his role was tremendous when he understood what needed to be done and went after, the plan to do that. So I think that he was also instrumental in his way, in his time.
Do you have any insight into why he became the vice presidential nominee in 1960? And that's not the subject of your book. I know I said it's off the wall.
No, it's a good question. I do think it might have, it was to win Southern support. I mean, clearly. And I don't know that in some ways Kennedy was perceived as a New England liberal, but in other ways he was not. He was kind of conservative in many ways as well. So I don't know that the conservative angle was all that much. But I'm not read in enough on that to really say anything that's terribly intelligent.
No, you just did. It was very intelligent. Thank you.
First of all, thank you. I very much enjoyed this. It's great.
Oh, thank you.
Does your book talk about any of their personal criticisms of each other that they may have held privately and the other didn't know about?
I know some of that came out not so long ago. I think, was it Jackie Kennedy who was very critical of Martin Luther King? And I think really there was criticism, certainly. I mean, and it's there throughout the book that Martin Luther King always felt that John Kennedy wasn't moving fast enough, was taking token actions, and he wanted him to take the big steps that he was reluctant to do for those 2.5 years. John Kennedy, I think he had sort of private admiration for Martin Luther King and an understanding of his power, and he needed to sort of understand it more and to tap more into it. There were times when they were having discussions in the White House. There was one particular case, it's in the book. I can't remember exactly what the moment was, but it was a critical moment in the civil rights crisis, and Kennedy wanted to hear what Martin Luther King had to say, what Martin Luther King thinks should be done, or what he thought the reaction would be among his people. And so that he had one of his lieutenants, Kennedy had one of his lieutenants go and call Martin Luther King while the other advisors and Kennedy folks were discussing this issue. And then he came back and told Kennedy and the crowd that, King thinks this, but he was a little cagey about what his advice was, but it sort of more shows that Kennedy had this respect and understanding that King was a voice that really had to be listened to if he was going to make any progress and if he was going to do the right thing.
So, hoping not to be repetitive. Oh, by the way, my first comment is you're the nonfiction editor of the Washington Post.
Yes.
I spend most of my time on Facebook trying to convince people that the whole Post is nonfiction. Some of my right-wing friends.
I'm in charge of all of that.
I hope you're in charge of the whole thing.
Actually, I'm the editor-in-chief in charge of all of the facts of Washington.
Good.
Nonfiction books.
I see. Okay. All right. Good. That's reassuring. I don't want to be too repetitive on the Johnson question, but I was thinking along similar lines. Do you think, to what degree do you think, and again, this is a little beyond the scope of your book, but that the death of John Kennedy and then also Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, it's a tough question, but did it possibly have a net positive effect on moving forward civil rights, or would they have been able to achieve more had they lived?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it did push it forward, because one of the first speeches that Lyndon Johnson gave after Kennedy was assassinated was that he wanted to honor his legacy on civil rights, and he was going to move forward with that. So he already sort of pushed that ball forward and let people know that how important that was to the Kennedy administration and how important he thought it was to the whole nation right now, right at that time. And so I do think there was a benefit, and it did move a little bit faster because of the tragedies that occurred in some ways. And that's sort of what happens, I think, with civil rights as we see with progress, it is punctuated by great tragedy. The book has several instances of that, even on that night when Kennedy gave his famous speech on June 11, and Martin Luther King was so ecstatic, and many blacks around the country were very excited that things were really moving forward. On that very same night was the night that Medgar Evers came home after being out and working on his efforts in civil rights and was shot dead in his driveway, and his children heard it and came running out and saw him. So you have this trend of, with all kinds of efforts to push our country forward in all sorts of ways, in particular in civil rights, where you feel like you're moving forward and you just always kind of run into a wall, and you have terrible tragedy and you step backwards. It happened again after the Great March on Washington, after King gave his I Have a Dream speech. Just a few weeks after that, where it was that terrible bombing at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham that killed 4 little girls. So, they thought that march went off beautifully. It was peaceful. It was forward-looking. It achieved a lot. And Kennedy was overwhelmed, and he thought it was great. And we were really moving forward. And then you have another one of these instances where you just get pulled up by the short hairs. And in some ways, that's sort of the same thing that you were referencing. And the deaths of those men were so tragic, but in a way maybe helped push things forward. It's just the course of history.
Thank you again for being here.
Oh, thank you.
I'm just wondering if Jack Kennedy's evolution into a deeper understanding of civil rights and the need to move it forward, if it was so much his own initiative, or how much influence do you think came from his brother Bobby?
Good question. Many people ask that question, and it's an excellent question. And I do get into that in the book as well, though I try to focus on the influence of Martin Luther King. But Bobby Kennedy was always there. Bobby Kennedy, as we know, was a more passionate figure than John Kennedy. And he was also, I think, which I talk about in the book, was evolving a lot faster than his brother John. And I think he made that clear. Even though he was trying to do his brother's bidding, and his brother wanted to slow down and wanted to do these other things, Bobby was always there, like, that enthusiastic puppy wanting to bark and push his brother forward to do bigger and greater things on civil rights. And we certainly saw that after John was assassinated, in the way that Bobby evolved through until his death. So it's pretty remarkable.
Oh, thank you. Who has moral authority today? And if there is someone, would it make a difference the same way?
That's a great question. Moral authority. It sort of raises the question of how different we are today from, like I was trying to get at in sort of the talk there, from 50 years ago, from 30 years ago, from a year ago. But partly I think we may not have some of the figures who have moral authority to lead us in a way that figures of the past have. But I think if those moral authorities are there, they have a harder time getting their message across, and being heard is part of the problem as well, because we live in a different media generation as well. That the media is so fractured and so diffuse that it's really difficult for some people who accept, I completely contradict myself if I mention our president, because he used the media beautifully to push himself very high and far. But many others who want to express themselves and want to have a moral impact in a broad way, and maybe come from a lower base, have a harder time attracting the larger audience, because there are so many audiences out there, and it's so fractured. I think in Martin Luther King's day and in Kennedy's, we had 3 networks. We had a few very strong newspapers and news weeklies, and they really set the mood and standard of what kind of news and media the diet of what the population got. Today, it's, as you all know, it's just across the board. It's every small internet site. It's Facebook. It's Twitter. It's still, thank God, the New York Times and the Washington Post, and still the networks. But there are more networks. There are cable networks, and there are competing cable networks. And there's just too much noise almost for, I think, and I'd love to hear other people's ideas, for a moral voice to rise and guide us in a way that Martin Luther King was able to, or even John Kennedy was able to. If anybody else has better ideas, please.
I agree with you. I'm so happy that you brought me.
No, I think.
I'm glad to hear your point.
I think that's all of what you said was a very interesting and an interesting point. One thing I'd like to key in on that you were sort of getting at with the Baldwin Buckley thing is the problem today, especially how people don't want to listen to each other, especially different people. They don't want to listen to each other. And that's the way you learn and understand and grow and develop a compassion and understanding of where someone else comes from. And that's part of what this book is all about, is the understanding of empathy both ways. Everybody has to sort of try to understand where that other person is. One of my favorite parts of the book is there's a scene where Bobby Kennedy wants to know more about what's going on in the civil rights movement. He feels like he doesn't get it enough, and he invites James Baldwin to his house, and they have a very brief conversation because his plane was late. He couldn't, Kennedy had to get into D.C., and so he wanted to continue this conversation another day, and he asked Baldwin to get together a bunch of African-American luminaries who he could meet with, and they could have a chat, and he just wanted to hear what they're thinking so he could start to understand. So they had this get-together a few days later, I think it was, where they met in New York, and it was Baldwin, it was, I'm blanking on the names. Lorraine Hansberry, right? Kenneth Clark, is that right? A couple others, and there was a black soldier. I can't recall his name either, but he wasn't famous. He was a civil rights guy. He'd been in the army, I think, and they all gathered in this room to talk. But as soon as Bobby Kennedy arrived, he started getting berated by all these people for what he hadn't done. And Lorraine Hansberry went after him. She had some very good pointed things to say. And then this soldier started talking to him in really harsh terms. And at one point he said, I wouldn't serve in the military again. I don't want to serve this country. I don't think that's right because of the way this country is now. And to Bobby, who was very much a guy who believed in his country, that really stabbed him. It really hurt him. So he kind of sat down. He was kind of stunned, and he sat there. He couldn't believe all of these people were attacking him the way they were because he felt he was doing something good. He was trying to help. He was trying to improve the situation that was horrible. And Harry Belafonte was there too. I remember too. So this session ended. Bobby went his way. Everybody else went their way. And Bobby was just desolate for days afterwards. But then he realized that these guys, by attacking him and giving their side so fervently, that he needed to really stop and think about this a little bit more. Maybe he felt he was doing something, but he hadn't been doing enough. So he spent the next, I don't know how long, thinking hard about what had been said to him. And in some ways, this, according to the people who knew him and were around him, was one of the great moments that drove him forward in his own evolution in understanding the need for empathy, for understanding where that other man, that other woman is in their life, in their perspective, and how they approach life. But it's not easy, and it doesn't come easily. It takes a lot of hard work. And that's, I think, what he was trying to do and what he succeeded in doing. And the only way that we can get there is if everybody on all sides is willing to put in that hard work. But I think, as you were saying, there's not a lot of people who want to do that right now in the environment we're in. And that's the sadness we're all suffering from, I think, at this point. There's my preaching. But anyway.
Mr. Levingston, thank you for sharing your insights and helping to remind us of what we were and could possibly be again. I very much liked the closing quote that you shared with us from Dr. King about the difficulty of educating a president. And I'm wondering if Dr. King took any lessons from his relationship with JFK and applied them in the subsequent relationship with President Johnson that you might be aware of.
Oh boy, I wish I could answer that, but I'm not smart enough on Johnson and that relationship to know. Anybody here, are you?
Next book.
Next book. Yes, that would, but Johnson's been pretty well covered. It'd be hard to top that. Sorry. Anyway, thank you all.
Thank you again. I know we're ready to tie this up, but a lot of us mentioned feeling this sense of sadness since previous administrations and this period of time we lived through so long ago. And we're looking for moral authority from somewhere, and I feel better each day, I think, being in a group like this where we share memories, share history, and try to look forward the best we can with research like this as a foundation. I think we have to continue to look for moral authority within ourselves. I have to keep reminding myself of that. And we're going to find our next leaders where we least expect them, and they may be among us, and they may be our neighbors, and they may be our grandchildren, but I do think there's a reason to keep hope alive. And thank you for reminding me of that.
Thank you.